Wear white tomorrow, the Mafia boss said. Then he canceled his own wedding for me. The night before his wedding to another woman, the most feared man in Providence stood in my little kitchen, took my flour-dusted hands in his, and said 4 words that turned my whole life upside down. Wear white tomorrow. He didn't explain himself. He didn't beg my forgiveness. He just looked at me with those dark, tired eyes and waited for an answer I didn't know how to give. And heaven help me, the next morning I put on the only white dress I owned and walked into a church full of powerful strangers who hated me. I watched that man stand at the altar where a bride who wasn't me was supposed to join him. And then I watched him cancel his own wedding in front of 200 guests. What I couldn't understand yet was why he had asked me to come, or why I had obeyed him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Joanna Mercer. I'm 43 years old, and until that spring, I believed romance was something that happened to other women, younger women, prettier women, women who were free. I lived with my mother, Helen, in a tired old boarding house on a side street in Bristol County, Rhode Island. The house belonged to my stepbrother, Caleb, and in a way that took me years to see clearly, so did I. My days had been the same for 15 years, ever since my father died and left Caleb the house. I was up before dawn lighting the furnace, cooking breakfast for 6 boarders, washing sheets, scrubbing floors, and balancing the books Caleb never bothered to understand. He collected the rents. I did everything else. Whenever I hinted at finding work of my own, he'd remind me of Mama's medical bills and what he called our housing debt, as if we were tenants instead of family. Mama was 74, with arthritic hands and a mind sharp as a sewing needle. She'd been a hospital nurse for 30 years, and now she spent her days in the front parlor, reading and watching the street. Everything I did for her. My only escape was a cardboard box of second-hand romance novels I bought for $1 each at the church rummage sale. At night, I'd read about women being courted and chosen, and I'd close the book feeling lonelier than before. Caleb wasn't cruel in any way you could point to. He was something smaller and harder to fight. He was comfortable. He liked his fishing trips and his card games, and he liked them funded by my unpaid labor. "Where would you even go, Joanna?" he'd say, not unkindly, whenever I spoke of leaving. "You and Mama wouldn't last a month out there." And I believed him. That was the worst of it. I believed him. The night everything began, I was volunteering at the spring parish supper at St. Bridget's Hall, the same as every year. I spooned chicken and dumplings onto Mrs. Abernathy's plate because her hands shook too badly to hold the ladle. I carried trays for the ladies whose hips had given out. I was nobody important in that room, just the quiet woman in the gray volunteer dress who made sure everyone else was fed before she sat down. Near the end of the evening, a sparrow got trapped inside the hall, beating itself against the high windows while the other volunteers swatted at it with brooms. I asked them to stop. Then I stood on a chair, held my breath, and cupped that terrified little bird in my apron until it went still. I carried it outside and opened my hands, and it flew off into the dark without a backward glance. I remember thinking it was the luckiest creature in Rhode Island. When I turned around, a man was standing in the shadow of the doorway, watching me. He was tall, near 60, with silver at his temples and an overcoat that cost more than our roof. He didn't clap like the others had. He just looked at me as though I were something he'd been searching a long time to find. Our eyes held for 1 second, maybe 2. Then a younger man hurried over and whispered something urgent in his ear, and the stranger was gone. I didn't learn his name that night. I didn't learn it for weeks. But I found out later that the man in the doorway was Raffaele Orsini, the head of the oldest crime family in Providence, a widower of 11 years, a man whose name made politicians lower their voices. And I found out something stranger still. From that night on, a man with every resource in the state tried to find me, and somehow, impossibly, he failed. That failure was not an accident. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, like your whole world was built to serve somebody else's comfort, then you already understand the woman I used to be. Stay with me, because that woman is about to be seen. And if these stories about second chances and late-blooming love matter to you, take 1 second to like this video and subscribe. It truly helps us keep telling them. What I didn't know was that the weeks after that supper had driven Raffaele Orsini half out of his mind. He'd sent his most trusted advisor, an elegant older man named Paolo Serrano, to find the woman from the parish hall. And Paolo had come back empty-handed again and again. No useful record at the parish, he reported. No one who knew her name. Meanwhile, a florist's box arrived at our boarding house with no card, and Caleb told the delivery boy there'd been a mistake and sent it away. 3 weeks later, on a wet Tuesday morning, I was helping old Mrs. Kowalski board the number 6 bus with her grocery bags when I heard engines behind me, the wrong kind of engines for our street, low and heavy and expensive. I turned around and my blood went cold. 3 black cars had pulled to the curb like something out of a crime photograph. Doors opened. Men in dark suits stepped out and scanned the sidewalk, and from the middle car stepped the stranger from St. Bridget's Hall. Only now I knew his face, because his face had been in the newspaper my whole adult life. Raffaele Orsini was walking toward me on a public sidewalk, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. I couldn't run, because Mrs. Kowalski's hand was gripping my sleeve, and her knees didn't run anywhere. So I stood there frozen, a 43-year-old woman clutching a bag of oranges, while the most dangerous man in New England crossed the pavement toward me. He stopped a respectful distance away, and I watched him take in my face, my worn coat, and my terror. I saw something shift in his expression, something that looked almost like grief. "Forgive me," he said in a voice far gentler than his reputation. "I didn't mean to frighten you." Then he did the last thing I expected. He stepped back, raised one hand, and the men and the cars melted away down the street. He let me leave. He didn't ask my name. He didn't ask anything. I shook the whole bus ride home. When I told Caleb about the black cars that evening, the color drained out of his face in a way I couldn't explain. "You stay away from people like that," he snapped, sharper than I'd ever heard him, and then he wouldn't say another word about it. A week later, he suddenly had money to fix the leaking roof he'd sworn we couldn't afford for 3 years. I should have wondered about that. I should have wondered about a lot of things. The next time I saw him, there were no cars, no suits, no men with earpieces. It was the number 6 bus again, a Thursday morning, and he was sitting 3 rows back in a plain gray sweater and corduroy trousers, reading the newspaper like a retired schoolteacher. My heart still jumped when I recognized him. But a man on a public bus, dressed like anybody's grandfather, is a different proposition from a man flanked by gunmen. When our eyes met, he simply nodded and went back to his paper. He got off at my stop. He kept 10 paces behind me all the way to the market, and when I finally gathered the nerve to turn and confront him, he held up both hands like a man surrendering to a cashier. "I'm not following you," he said. "I buy apples at the same store." Then he paused, and the faintest smile touched his mouth, though I'd be lying if I said I minded the company. I should have walked away. Instead, I heard myself ask, "Who are you, really?" "My name is Rafe," he said. "Just Rafe." He didn't lie to me exactly, but he didn't hand me the truth either, and I'd learn later how much that cost us both. We walked to the market together, and he told me he'd been at St. Bridget's that night by obligation, and that he'd watched me all evening. "You fed half the room before you fed yourself," he said, "and then you saved a bird nobody else had time for. I wanted to know what kind of woman does that." After that, he appeared on the Thursday bus as regular as the weather, always alone, always plainly dressed. He never crowded me, never pried, never once mentioned money or power. We talked about small things at first, the failing apple harvest, the leaky roof at St. Bridget's, the best way to keep squirrels off a feeder. It had been so long since anyone had asked my opinion about anything that at first I barely knew how to answer. But I learned. It was the remembering that undid me. I mentioned once, in passing, that Mama took her tea without sugar, and the next week he arrived with a tin of the exact Irish breakfast tea she loved. I told him I'd always liked morning birds, and a week later I found a small bag of seed left on our windowsill with no note at all. On the bus, he'd help old Mr. Ferreira carry his marketing up the hill, and he'd remember, week after week, that the man's ailing wife liked yellow plums best. But mostly he listened. He listened to me like my small words were worth keeping, as though everything I said deserved to be written down somewhere permanent. Then came the afternoon he met Mama. I'd invited him for tea before I could talk myself out of it, and he arrived with his sleeves already rolled up, because on the walk up our path he'd noticed the porch rail wobbling under my hand. Before he'd even said hello properly, he asked where Caleb kept the toolbox, and he spent 40 minutes on his knees resetting that rail, while Mama watched from her chair with her eyebrows raised and a look on her face I couldn't read. Over tea, Mama tested him the way nurses test everything, gently and thoroughly. She asked about his family, and he said he'd buried his wife 11 years ago and still set 2 cups out some mornings before he caught himself. She asked about his work, and he said, imports and family obligations, which was true the way a lighthouse is a lamp. When he left, he carried Mrs. Ellery's grocery bags up the street for her, a woman who couldn't have offered him anything but thanks. "I like him," Mama announced that evening, working a blanket over her knees. "Mama, you know what people say about men with his kind of money," I said. She gave me a look. "I've nursed rich men and poor men, Joanna. Money doesn't make a man gentle with a porch rail or patient with an old woman's stories. That's either in him or it isn't." Then she said the thing I carried through everything that came after. Fear can protect a heart, baby, but it can imprison it too. I won't pretend I wasn't afraid. Some part of me remembered the black cars and the newspaper photographs, and some part of me noticed things I couldn't explain. The split knuckle on his right hand one Thursday that he dismissed with a joke. The morning he arrived looking like he hadn't slept, and touched my elbow as though I were the only solid thing in the world. The dark sedan that once idled across the street until he glanced at it, and it rolled quietly away. Once, a sleek older man in a fine suit was waiting beside that sedan, and Rafe's whole face changed when he saw him. "An old friend," he told me afterward. "Paolo. He worries." But I saw how Paolo looked at me through the windshield, cool and measuring, like a man counting the cost of something. And I remember thinking it strange, later, that when Rafe finally introduced us properly, Paolo already seemed to know where I lived and what I did. Small things. They only look small at the time. Because here is the truth I was ashamed to admit. I was falling in love with him. At 43, when I'd made my peace with being nobody's choice, I was falling in love with a man who carried groceries and fixed rails and waited outside St. Bridget's during Mass because, as he told me, he wouldn't pretend a faith he didn't feel, not even to stand closer to me. He never once used a gift to make me owe him. He just kept showing up, ordinary as rain. The night he held my hand, we were sitting on our repaired porch watching the sun go down over the rooftops, and his fingers folded around mine like they had every right to be there. "Joanna," he said quietly, "there are things about my life I haven't told you, things I'm not proud of." My heart stumbled, but I looked at that tired, gentle face and made the worst kind of bargain with myself. Whatever it is, I thought, it can't matter more than this. God forgive me. It mattered. Looking back, I can see the pressure building under him like water under ice. Some Thursdays he was fully mine, warm and present. Other days he'd go quiet at the mention of the months ahead, or step off the bus early when a certain car appeared. Once I asked if he was in trouble, and he took my hand and said, "Not the kind you can help me with, and not the kind I'll ever let touch you." I believed he could arrange that. I believed a lot of things. Mama watched it all with those nurse's eyes. One evening she said, "That man is fighting something, and he thinks keeping you in the dark is the same as keeping you safe." I told her she was imagining it. But that night I lay awake turning her words over, because they had the terrible ring of truth. Every novel I'd ever read said love was supposed to make you feel chosen. For once in my life, I did feel chosen. So why did I also feel like a secret? The truth arrived on a Tuesday, in a manila envelope Caleb left on the kitchen table. He'd been strutting for days about his biggest contract, a fortune in room bookings for out-of-town guests, a society wedding that would put our boarding house on the map. He'd left the paperwork out like a trophy. I picked it up, meaning to admire it, and the whole world tilted. At the top of the first page were two names joined by a gold ribbon, Raffaele Orsini and Lenora Valenti. There was a photograph, too, clipped from the society page. My Rafe, the man in the gray sweater who'd fixed my porch rail, stood in a black tuxedo beside an elegant silver-haired woman, under a headline about the wedding of the decade, a marriage that would unite two of New England's most powerful families. His full name stared up at me. Orsini. The name from the newspapers. The name people whispered. My Rafe was the Mafia boss of Providence, and he was marrying someone else in 11 days. I don't remember sitting down, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, Mama was holding my hand, and the photograph was on the floor. The worst part wasn't the danger, or even the lie about his name. The worst part was Lenora Valenti's face. She looked kind. And I understood, with dreadful clarity, that I had been something hidden, something kept. A woman in a gray volunteer dress good enough to ride a bus with, but not good enough to stand beside him in the light. I could have waited for him to come to me. Instead, I did something I'd never done in my life. I took the number 6 bus in the wrong direction, to the address printed on the wedding contract, an old stone social club on Federal Hill. And I told the man at the door to tell Raffaele Orsini that Joanna Mercer was waiting, and that if he wanted to keep his secrets, he'd better come down and collect them. My hands were shaking. My voice didn't. He came out fast, and when he saw the clipping in my hand, every trace of Rafe drained out of his face, and what was left was the man from the newspapers. "It's a business arrangement," he said. "It was set in motion before I saw you. Lenora and I are marrying to stop a war between our families. There is no love in it. There's no home in it." Then he said the words I dreaded most. "I was going to tell you. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me," I repeated. "You let me love a man who doesn't exist. You let me bring you into my mother's house, and all the while you had a bride waiting at month's end." He reached for my hands and I stepped back. The hurt that crossed his face nearly broke me, but I held my ground. "I have spent 15 years being owned by somebody else's obligations. I will not be your secret. I will not be your comfort on the way to another woman's altar." "Let me fix this," he said, and there was something dangerous in his voice now, something that had made strong men tremble. "Tell me what you need. Money. A house. I'll end it, just give me time." And that offer, that kind, terrible offer, is what finally freed me. Because he still didn't understand. I didn't want to be paid for my silence, or a wedding canceled like a debt being settled. I wanted to be chosen, openly, with no contract attached. So I said no, and I walked away. I cried for 3 days. I won't dress it up prettier than that. Mama held my hand and never said I told you so. Mama never kicked a person who was down. Caleb, meanwhile, was beside himself, but not for me. He'd heard whispers that the wedding might be in trouble, and his golden contract with it. "What did you do?" he demanded, and for the first time I saw my stepbrother exactly as he was, a small man selling his family by the pound. What Rafe told me only later was that my walking away did something to him that no rival family had ever managed. He sat in his study that night and asked himself the question he should have asked weeks earlier. Why had it been so hard to find me after the parish supper? Paolo, the finest finder of people in New England, had searched for one parish volunteer and failed for weeks. Raffaele Orsini had not survived 30 years in his world by believing in that kind of bad luck, so he pulled the threads himself. Paolo's search reports had named parishes I'd never set foot in, while St. Bridget's, where I volunteered monthly, appeared nowhere. He found that flowers he'd sent had been turned away from our address by arrangement, not by accident. And then he found the bank records, regular payments, routed through 2 shell companies, from Paolo Serrano to Caleb Ward, going back almost 3 years, disguised as roof repairs and loan relief. My stepbrother hadn't just been using me. He'd been paid to keep me trapped. The pattern, when Rafe laid it out later, was breathtaking in its patience. Paolo had never wanted the boss's chair. Too many bullets came with it. He wanted to be the hand behind the chair, and the Valenti marriage was his masterpiece, a union that would make him indispensable to both families. A widower in love with a nobody from Bristol County threatened all of it. So he kept me poor, kept Caleb beholden, kept the searches empty, and hurried the wedding forward before the heart could ruin the ledger. Rafe sat with all of it for a long time, and then he made 2 decisions. One of them he told no one at all. The other brought him to my kitchen on the last night of April, the night before his wedding. I knew he was marrying Lenora in the morning. The whole state knew. And there he stood in my little kitchen, my flour on his cuffs from my baking through grief, looking at me like a man saying goodbye and hello in the same breath. "Wear white tomorrow," he said. That was all. No explanation, no plea, no plan laid out to win me over. I asked him what he meant, and he said, "If you trust me at all, after everything, wear white and come to the church. And if you can't, then know that what happens tomorrow was always going to happen and never your doing." He kissed my forehead, the first time he had ever kissed me anywhere, and he left me standing in the kitchen with my heart in pieces. I was still staring at the door when Mama spoke from the hallway. She'd heard every word. "Go," she said. I turned on her in disbelief, and she rolled her chair closer and took my hand. "Not for him, Joanna, for you. If you hide in this house tomorrow, you're letting Caleb and Paolo and your own fear make one more decision for you, and they have made enough. Put on the white dress, walk in there on your own 2 feet, and make whatever you see answer to you." I still lie awake wondering about that night, so let me ask you, if you were standing in my kitchen that night, 43 years old, humiliated, in love with a man hours from marrying someone else, would you have put on that white dress and walked into his wedding? Or would you have stayed home and protected your pride? Tell me honestly in the comments. There is no easy answer. I know because I lived it. I owned exactly 1 white dress. I'd bought it years earlier at the same rummage sale as my novels, for no reason I could have named, a simple thing with lace at the collar, and it had hung in the back of my closet ever since like a life I wasn't invited to. That night I laid it across my bed and looked at it for a long time. Then I sat down with Mama's sewing basket and let out the hem by lamplight, and with every stitch I felt something in me growing quieter and surer, like a woman sewing her own ending at last. The Church of the Holy Name had never seen a morning like it. 200 guests in silk, flowers banked around the altar rail, photographers held back by men who looked carved out of the same stone as the building. I slipped in through a side entrance in my rummage sale white dress, and every head turned. I heard the whispers crawl down the pews. Who is she? Who wears white to another woman's wedding? I kept my chin up and walked to the seat Mama had saved near the front. Paolo Serrano stood near the altar in a pearl gray vestment of a suit, and when he saw me, something almost like satisfaction crossed his face. I understood it only later. He thought Rafe had made a lovesick blunder, that the boss's little secret had come to make a scene, and that the scandal would fracture both families and leave one calm, indispensable man to pick up the pieces. He actually smiled at me. It was the smile of a man who believes he has counted every card in the deck. Then the music changed, and Rafe walked to the altar. He looked like a man going to his execution and his coronation at once. When his eyes found me in that sea of silk, they stopped and held, and something in his shoulders eased. He gave me one slow nod, the kind you give a person you've asked a terrible favor of, then turned to face the doors where his bride would appear. My heart was beating so hard I was sure the whole front pew could hear it. The doors opened, and the whole church gasped as one. Lenora Valenti stood in the light of the doorway, wearing deep, unmistakable blue. Not ivory, not champagne. Blue, the color of a woman attending a wedding, not having one. She walked down that aisle with her silver head high, and she did not stop at the altar steps. She climbed them, took her place beside Rafe, and together they turned to face the congregation like partners in a business, which I finally understood is exactly what they had always been. Rafe raised a hand for silence, and the church gave it to him. "There will be no wedding today," he said, and the words dropped like stones into still water. "Lenora and I entered this agreement to secure peace between our families. We end it the same way, by choice, before any vow is spoken." Lenora's voice followed, clear and steady as a bell. "The alliance between our families stands," she said, "but it will stand on honest terms, not on the back of a marriage neither of us wanted." For one breathless moment, I thought it might actually be that simple. Then Paolo stepped forward, his voice smooth and reasonable and cold. "Don Orsini, think what you're doing. The waterfront dispute, the debts, the men who only agreed to peace because of this union. Without it, we bleed." He turned to the senior men in the front rows. "And look why. Ask what has happened to our boss's judgment, that a boarding house servant in a white dress can unmake 30 years of discipline." Every eye swung to me. That was the moment the old Joanna would have sunk through the floor. Instead, I stood. My legs shook, but my voice came out clear enough to reach the back pew. "I didn't come here to unmake anything," I said. "I came because a man asked me to stand in a church as myself, for once, in my own dress, owing nobody anything. If your 30 years of discipline can't survive one honest woman sitting down, then maybe it wasn't discipline. Maybe it was just fear in a good suit." I will remember the silence that followed for the rest of my life. Then Rafe did something I had never seen. He laughed, one short, warm note, and looked at Paolo like a man setting down a heavy load. "You want to speak of judgment, Paolo?" he said. "Let's speak of yours." He nodded to a young man by the door, and a folder passed down the front rows, past silver hair and dark suits, and I watched face after face go hard as they read. It was all there. The falsified search reports that had kept me invisible for weeks. The payments to my stepbrother, 3 years of them dressed up as charity. Then Lenora added her own quiet testimony. Paolo had pressed her family with fears he himself manufactured, inflating old quarrels to make the marriage seem the only door out of a burning building. One by one, the senior men looked up from the folder, and I watched Paolo Serrano discover that the room no longer belonged to him. Rafe did not shout. That was the frightening thing about it. "You served my father," he said, "so I will not serve you the way you served me. You are removed from every office and every confidence of this family as of this hour. You will retire, and you will be left in peace, which is more mercy than you showed her." Then he added that Caleb's bookings would be honored at full price by the family office, so no innocent boarders would suffer. But Paolo's private arrangement was finished. Then, in front of 200 people, in the church where he was supposed to marry another woman, Raffaele Orsini walked down off that altar and came to me. He did not kneel. He offered no ring, and I thank God for that, because I would not have taken it that day. Instead, he looked at me a long moment and said, "You want to know why I asked you to wear white? Every time I have ever seen you, Joanna, you were dressed for somebody else's work. An apron in your stepbrother's kitchen, a gray volunteer dress in a parish hall, a boarding house uniform with your hands raw from other people's laundry. I have watched you serve this whole world without once being asked what you wanted. I asked you to wear white because I wanted you to walk into a room, just once, belonging to no one but yourself. Not to me, not to anyone. And whether you ever stand beside me again is your decision, freely made, with nothing owed and nothing hidden between us." I couldn't speak. I nodded, and the tears came, and he walked me out of that church past 200 stunned faces, past a smiling mama, past Lenora, who pressed my fingers and whispered, "Well done, both of you." Outside, the spring light was so bright it hurt. He kissed my knuckles like a man in one of my novels and let me go home to think. He had canceled his own wedding for me. Now came the harder thing, learning to be chosen. The weeks after were the strangest and sweetest of my life. Caleb's power over us dissolved. With Paolo's money gone and the family office dealing straight, there was no debt left to hide behind. That was when Mama told me the truth she'd held for 15 years. There had never been any legal obligation keeping us in that house, no medical debt that bound us, nothing but a story Caleb told and I believed. "I stayed because you stayed, baby," she said. "I was waiting for you to stop waiting." By summer, Mama and I had moved into a modest white cottage near the water in Warren, a place I chose myself, its porch rail solid because I checked it every week. I kept my parish work, and I took a paid position managing a small guest house 2 streets over, my first paycheck with my own name on it at 43 years old. And Rafe courted me, openly, in daylight, on the number 6 bus, at the fish market, on the steps of St. Bridget's, where anyone could see. He never once tried to hurry me. When I asked why he kept riding the bus when he owned half the cars in Providence, he said, "Because this is where I found you, and I never want to be the man in the black cars again." Some evenings he fixed things around my guest house and let the tenants believe he was a retired carpenter, and I think those were the hours he was happiest. Lenora came to tea in June, wearing yellow and carrying a peach pie she'd baked badly herself. She and Mama got on like a house afire. "I should tell you," she said to me, "I spent months dreading that marriage, and I didn't have the courage to end it alone. You walking into that church in white gave me my exit with my dignity intact." She smiled. "He chose you over my family's approval and gave me my freedom back in the bargain. That's a rare man, Joanna." It was Mama who brought the past into the light on a rainy autumn afternoon. She asked Rafe to the cottage, and then she opened the tin nursing box she'd kept shut for years and took out a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. Rafe's face changed as he looked at the first page. "That's Lucia's hand," he whispered. "His late wife." Mama nodded. "I nursed her those last months. She wrote letters she never sent. I think she meant them for you." We read them together. In the 3rd letter, I stopped breathing. Lucia wrote about a volunteer who sat beside her when fear kept her awake, who brushed her hair and read aloud when her hands grew too weak to hold a book, and who refused all payment. She never got the woman's full name. She called her my night angel from Bristol County. 11 years ago, during my one season of hospital volunteering, I had sat with a dying woman named Lucy. I had never known she was Lucia Orsini. Rafe wept, that strong, contained man, at my mother's kitchen table. He hadn't sought me out because of Lucia. He'd fallen for a woman freeing a sparrow at a parish supper. And yet the kindness that made him love me had once comforted the person he'd loved most, a decade before we met. For me, those letters broke open something closed my whole life, the belief that my small, unnoticed acts had never mattered. They had mattered. They had been carried like a lantern through 11 years of grief. Months later, on a bright October morning, I walked back into the Church of the Holy Name. There were no photographers this time, no contracts, no families weighing alliances, just the people who loved us. Mama sat in the front pew beside Lenora, both of them dressed up like queens. And at the altar stood Rafe, in a dark suit and a plain tie, watching the door the way he'd watched me that first night at St. Bridget's, like he'd been searching a long time and had finally stopped. I wore the same white dress from the wedding that never was, altered with my own hands to fit the woman I'd become. No one had ordered me to wear it. No alliance depended on it. No debt required it. and before Rafe took my hand, he turned to the front pew, bent down, and kissed my mother's hand. Mama's eyes shone. A sparrow had gotten into the church, and as the vows were spoken, it flew out the open doors into the light. I took that as a blessing. People ask me what the difference is between the love I read about all those years and the love I finally found. The novels taught me that someday someone might choose me. Rafe taught me something the novels never did. That being truly chosen never requires you to surrender your right to choose back. I was not rescued from my life. I walked out of it in a white dress, on my own 2 feet, toward a man who had learned to offer me a hand instead of a cage. If this story touched you, if you believe it's never too late to be seen, to be chosen, and to choose yourself first, please like this video and subscribe so they can find the next person who needs one. And tell me in the comments, do you believe the kindness we give away ever comes back to us, the way mine came back after 11 years? I read every comment. Until the next story, be gentle with yourself. You never know who is watching you set the sparrows free.